Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Let's start with the conversations that have been sparked by that viral video of a teenager who was fined 1,000 ringgit for purportedly pulling down his face mask while waiting on a train platform, and it left him in tears. Now, this video had raised questions about seemingly uneven enforcement of the compulsory face mask rule. As you know, quite a number of politicians have been photographed without masks while in public places. This is photographic evidence, Sharaad.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are concerned about the question of double standards, and that's the perception, or uneven enforcement. There are even questions around, I guess, and this has happened in many parts of the world. I mean, should the police be involved in the question of the enforcement of these social distancing rules when they have so many other more pressing matters to deal with?
Who would enforce it if not the police?
Well, this is a very interesting question. It's about I think the way you think about the problem and whether this is a criminal act that needs to be stamped out at every possible moment, or a long-term change in public attitudes and behavior.
So remember, we spoke to Dr. Helmi from Pantai Hospital, and he is a physician of, I think, a chest physician, right? And he talked a little bit about this mandatory mask rule, and the idea is, yes, you need awareness, you need to change public behavior, but whether you should, make it the law, make it, to criminalize, to penalize not wearing it, I think that is also a problem. Who will enforce this? How do we ensure enforcement is consistent, making sure that, young, people are not selectively targeted.
But Melissa, I think it goes back again to, I think, our authoritarian culture. The choice that was made, I don't know by whom, to place the quantum of the fine at this extraordinary, 1,000 ringgit. How many people in Malaysia for whom that would be a substantial chunk of their monthly wages? And so when you have it at such an extraordinary level, then the question is why?
Well, the idea was for it to be a deterrent, right?
Well, I mean, yes, but you could whip people for that too, and that would be a deterrent. So there are principles involved in the relationship between a fine or a punishment and the crime that's committed, and must be commensurate with what is the infraction, right? So I think that's it. It seems quite out of the extraordinary to have such a high fine, considering what exactly is going wrong and what they're trying to change. Again, if we go back to the question of changing behavior, now it also opens up the possibility, Melissa, of corruption, because when you're saying to somebody, I can ruin your life, I'm going to make your month so miserable financially, perhaps then you can get into a bargaining kind of situation. And so
it could open up opportunities of corruption.
Absolutely. And I think that, and you see it on social chatter now, what is the going rate to sort of, to get through this and not get the 1,000 ringgit fine. Now, that situation we saw, which was, well televised, and it was all this publicity, of course, everybody's their best behavior. But when you have, in the powers of enforcement officers, this extraordinary ability to ruin people's financially, at least for that month when they get their wages, or in this case, a student, I mean, to think that give 1,000 ringgit burden on a student,
who apparently temporarily took off his mask. And I do want to say, you talked a little bit about changing behaviors, Sharaad. How many of us actually know of the 14 places and occasions that the National Security Council has mandated for, the wearing of face masks? And it's about, I think, a lack of education as well. So educate first before you penalize.
Yeah, but again, it comes back to our authoritarian culture. There is a love of punishment, and I think that is well established in our culture and in the agencies that we have, and they would rather punish than to educate, I think, and I think that is a major problem. And I do think corruption is something that we need to look out for because of the way in which these, these laws are structured.
Right,
I think it's a real big problem.
Speaking of which, another viral video in the news, this time of Wan Ahmad Faisal, Wan Ahmad Kamal, the Deputy Minister of Youth and Sports. In this video, he promised to leverage on his position in the government and party to issue support letters in exchange for votes. So Wan Faisal is contesting for the post of Chief of Armada, that's the youth wing of the Bersatu Party. Now in this video, Senator Wan Faisal said that all the endorsement letters that he will write will be CC'd to the Prime Minister. And to quote him, translated from Malay, "This is what this post is for. The post has been given to help you all, not for me alone, but to help you so that you can help me too." Now, that video has since quoted criticism about the use of support letters, some saying that it is a return of a Barisan national culture. Or has it always been practiced behind closed doors? And this is the, we're hearing about it publicly now.
Well, Melissa, this is a politician, I think, who brings a smile to the faces of just about everybody across the political spectrum because of his, I would say, his frankness, his forthrightness in saying what he thinks. And I think what is also interesting, of course, is the fact that this video was leaked and apparently by somebody within his own circle. So I'm not quite sure whether this was leaked in order to make him a lightning rod for criticism, or in fact to show him to be precisely the kind of politician that Malaysia needs. A man who won't shy away from saying what he thinks is the nature of politics, which is, patronage.
Okay.
Actually, so the big P is patronage, which is that, and you scratch my back, I scratch your back, in a like quid pro quo
Well,
issue.
the idea was, if I'm not mistaken, so Anthony Loke had come out and posted on his Facebook saying that after the Pakatan Harapan administration was sworn in as ministers, they had the MACC chief back then, Datuk Seri Muhammad Shukri Abdul, give a briefing in that briefing, they were, all ministers, deputy ministers as well, were ordered not to issue letters of support to anyone or even use words or comments in administrative letters or documents that could influence certain decisions made by the administration. Yeah,
so administrative decisions should be made on the basis of evidence, what cost-benefit analysis, all kinds of other yardsticks, and not whether the person making the request is influential or not. And I think it goes back to the way in which democracy, an import, as it were, from the West, is used here and deployed in very, very interesting ways, Melissa, with local politicians, with people for whom the rational idea, ideal notions of what a democracy and what good governance might be is actually not the point. The point
how much
is
weight,
extending.
Sharaad, is a letter of support?
It
really
take
away the weight of the letter
really
of
depends.
support.
Yeah, it depends on how the structure of governance. If you have a system where the prime minister's say is everything, and can determine, contracts amounting to billions of dollars, and we see in the multiple corruption cases we have how, because the individuals involved were high-ranking, that everybody down the line acceded to, and they just said yes or signed the papers or pushed it, and they were able, just by the force of their personality and the public office that they held, were able to steal money basically from the public purse. Now, that is not going to go away anytime soon. The Pakatan Harapan government were attempted to make a break from it. I don't think these changes were going to happen, very
not
quickly.
overnight.
Not overnight. No,
all right, we're going to take a quick break, but after this, we will be speaking to Orang Asli activists about the International Day of Indigenous Peoples that's coming up in just a couple minutes. Stay tuned to consider this.
By our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also the our spaces. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy. We are in the era of the new norm. Face mask, social distancing,
so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid closed conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this together.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly. Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social distancing, hand hygiene, and wearing of the face mask. It's a new norm. Let's not slack. We can do this.
We've done great so far, but the fight...
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Yesterday was the International Day for Indigenous Peoples, with the aim this year to highlight Indigenous peoples' resilience to COVID-19. Now, Indigenous peoples are one of, if not the poorest and most marginalized groups in Malaysia, and their vulnerability has really been further compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic, affecting their access to medicines, healthcare, food, education, and their livelihoods. Now, joining us on the show tonight, we have Colin Nicholas. He's the coordinator for the Centre for Orang Asli Concerns. Colin is both an activist and an academic. Good evening, Colin. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to begin, if I may, with the use of the term Indigenous communities. Now, I'm wondering about the use of this term, because wouldn't that also encompass and apply to all Bumiputras, including majority Malay communities? And also, Colin, I understand that there's been some debate about the terms Orang Asal and Orang Asli. Can you help explain what's at stake here?
Yes, there is a lot of confusion about the term, between the term Orang Asli and Orang Asal. When we use the term Orang Asli, we are referring specifically to the indigenous peoples, minority indigenous peoples of Peninsular Malaysia alone. But when we use the term Orang Asal, we are using it as a translation of the international law term indigenous peoples. So the Orang Asal of Malaysia are the Orang Asli of Peninsular Malaysia and the native peoples of Sabah and Sarawak. Are the Malays Orang Asal as well, indigenous peoples? Under international law definition of indigenous peoples, one of the criteria is that there must not be, indigenous peoples are dominated by somebody else with of dominant social structure. So we cannot say the Malays are the dominant people in sense. I mean, we cannot say that the Malays are not being dominated by any other people. No. So in that category, and also the Malays by the government have not claimed to be indigenous peoples at the UN Forum on Indigenous Peoples.
Colin, that's interesting, because you clarified a certain point, which also goes back to the question of what is it that we want to mean by indigenous, especially in relation to the environment, to ecological systems that are fragile. There is a link there between the two. Could you explain that for us, please?
So the indigenous peoples are the peoples of a particular territory who have been there since time immemorial, who have been never colonized or now part of a dominant structure, but who claim that particular ecological space or geographical area as their own customary land or tanah adat. So one of the main features is that you must be indigenous to that particular area. Your history, your culture, your identity, your language all comes from that particular area. So an indigenous person in Penang, indigenous person in Perak, for example, a Semai from Perak, cannot go to Sabah and say, I'm also an Orang Asal, no, therefore I have rights to your land in Sarawak. No, you're only indigenous to your particular area, geographical space.
But Colin, if your identity is then tied to a certain location, what happens when indigenous people move out of that location for jobs or for education?
No, you can move out. You can move out for jobs and for other kinds of work and so on. But you cannot, if you are displaced from your territory, then it becomes a very, very critical situation for the indigenous people, because your history, your identity, your acknowledgement of an indigenous person is linked to that particular area. So that is why many Orang Asal people reject resettlement, even if it's for a better place, with better facilities, with education access and health and so on, no? Because it's moving away from your homeland.
Colin, another, I think, critical issue, and this comes up in this year's commemoration of the indigenous peoples of the world, is the question of resilience and also of the knowledge they have and resources they gather from their traditions and their relationship to the natural environment. Does that theme for this year's celebrations, does that ring true of what's happening in this country? Do you see that as applying to our situation here in Malaysia?
Yes, very much. In some countries like Brazil and Northeast India and other, in the Navajo nations in the US, they were devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic. That means once the virus entered the village, it just spread and killed many people. But among the Orang Asli, for example, only 2 so far on record have contracted the disease, and always from outside. And the virus has not spread to Orang Asli areas for a number of reasons. One of them is many of them are living in isolated areas. And 2, they actually, cordoned off the area or prevented others from entering the area during the pandemic. And this is the situation which they are very familiar with from the past. Or they moved or retreated back into the forest to hide from the so-called virus, and they are only resilient because they are able to access the forest. Those Orang Asli who are now living in the towns, who are dependent on daily wage, no work, or who are dependent on rubber and oil palm and the price of rubber and the sale of oil palm, they were badly affected during the MCO we had,
Right.
So resilient.
Colin, if I may interrupt, I want to touch a little bit about what you said, because the idea of the Orang Asli moving back to the forest, being blockade their villages away, to lock down from this pandemic, it's kind of romanticized this myth that indigenous peoples are self-sufficient. That's not really the case, right? Because the pandemic has also impacted livelihoods in a certain respect.
That's right. So only if you had access to your traditional forest lands or you're still living in the forest could you so-called go back to the forest and depend on it, to some extent. But many Orang Asli, about 60% of Orang Asli, are no longer forest dependent. They are part of the national economy. They are in normal wage work as many other Malaysians, or involved in the agricultural sector. So they were affected very much by the pandemic.
Colin, there's a lot of talk about the ways in which human encroachment on natural environments is exposing us to, to the risk of more pathogens and so on and so forth.